Hello, welcome to Post Colonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and in this conversation, I have combined two previously published video lectures that talk about the role of language and power within the colonial context, but also within the post colonial context. So, if you're interested in the role of language in the power dynamics of colonialism, or what could otherwise also be termed linguistic imperialism, please do watch these videos. Thank you so much. Hello. Today I'll briefly talk about another important subject, which is language and power. Someone asked me a question today about the role of language and power within the colonial spaces during and after colonialism, and I thought I should record a brief lecture about it. Now, language plays a huge role in stabilizing the colonial power structures, and there's a lot of material written about it. But I'll be only referring to a few good works by some major scholars. Now, the way the colonizers established their hegemony was through their language policies. In most of the colonies in Africa, India, and elsewhere, the colonizers would introduce their educational system, which would be in the language of the colonizers, and the natives were required to, forced to, or encouraged to learn the language of the colonizers in order to establish themselves in the new emerging societies and polity, but also for their upward mobility. Now, the best book on this topic, on how the language not just creates an aura of power, but also rewrites the native subjectivities, is probably by Ngugi, Decolonizing the Mind, and I'll post a link to it in the description. In Decolonizing the Mind, Ngugi gives us three roles of language in a living culture. So the first role, of course, is simply that language is a code for understanding the social roles. It introduces us to the mode of production extant in a system, in a society. The second role is as a mode of communication. We use a common language to talk to each other. And the third role is language as a carrier, or not carrier, but carrier or container of culture, which means that we use language to pass on our past and present to the future generations. Now, when colonialism enacts its policies in cultures which do not have established written scripts, and the culture relies on an oral tradition, it is this third aspect of language that is totally disrupted. Because if you skip one or two generations, chances are people won't be able to pass their histories, their stories to the next generation, and that will be replaced by the colonial education. Now, what Ngugi talks about the colonial educational system is he gives us the story of a young boy who goes to a colonially administered school, leaves his village and goes to the school. In the school, what he's learning is, let's say, the English language. But in the process of learning the English language, he's also internalizing that this is the language of power. Then in most colonial schools, according to Ngugi, what would be done is in the beginning of the school day, one of the kids in the class will be given a token. And his job was to pass it on to the next kid whom he hears speaking a local language, a native language, which were called dialects. So by the end of the class day, the teacher will ask the students who has the token, and then they will tell him who gave it to him, and they'll have a whole chain. So then all those students who were reported on for having used the native language will be publicly humiliated in front of the class. So not only were these kids learning that English is the language of power and that they need to acquire it to, transcend their given lives or to gain upward mobility. What they were also internalizing was that somehow their own language and thus the culture associated with it is inferior. And that is what the language policies do. Now, for the role of English language in India, of course, the magisterial work comes from Gauri Vishwanathan, and you can read her book, Masks of Conquest, where she gives us the history of the entire conflict between the Anglicists and the Orientalists, and how Anglicists eventually win and English becomes part of the medium of instruction in India. And within that, of course, the most important document is Lord Macaulay's famous speech to the House of Lords, I think, in which he argues that the native Indians should be taught English. Now, part of his argument was that they should be taught English so that they can be incorporated within the hegemonic project of the empire. But he is very clear as to what kind of education he wants for the natives. The kind of education that he wanted, I mean, his words are they should be Indian in blood and English in sentiment. So to produce kind of human subjectivities or human beings who would be able to reproduce materials in English and maybe compute a little bit, and thus could be good clerks or good, takers of orders, but could not think for themselves. So that's how the colonial education worked in India, and Gauri Vishwanathan gives a wonderful account of it. There is another author, Bruce McCulley, whom I cite in my first book, Constructing Pakistan, who also writes about the same topic. But by and large, in India and elsewhere, the role that colonial languages play is not just to be a mode of communication, but in the process of learning the language, the natives also internalize those as superior languages, and hence to them, automatically then the colonial culture itself becomes superior. Now, this legacy lives on. I mean, I only have the examples of lived experience in Pakistan, but you can see in Pakistan even now, parents prefer their children to go to English medium schools. Most of the upward mobile, bourgeois, middle class Pakistanis who can speak good English, you will hear them making fun of people who don't speak good English, who don't have a good accent. And there are different terms that are used for them. There is a cultural divide between those who use English as their medium of instruction and probably medium of communication and those who don't. Now, this legacy was given to us through the colonial experience, but we have also perpetuated it within the national space, and you can see that in other colonies as well. People who have mastered the colonial languages can use them in ease and comfort, also somehow internalize that they are somehow superior to those who cannot. So these are some of the legacies of the colonial language policies and then their implementation in the colonial educational system. So for those of you studying post-colonialism, even though we rely on European languages and European texts, it is important to note that while we do that, just like Ngugi Chango in the Kenyan perspective, who works diligently to create, produce, and perpetuate literature in native languages, we also need to work with our colleagues who work on native languages and ensure that not only do they teach native languages and native literatures, but that those are preserved and that we learn collectively not to deride those who may not be good at the colonial languages, who may not speak good English, but who still have great and deeper knowledge of their own cultures and their own cultural artifacts, art, and literature. So these are some of my words on this topic. Hello. I hope this finds you well. I'm back again to further amplify on a topic that I had recorded a video recently. And I got some questions from some good friends and some good scholars from Pakistan, and I thought I should address those in a second recording on the same topic. And you can watch the earlier video. The link will appear in the top right corner over there shortly. and see for yourself what I had said in the first video. But the question posed to me was from a friend who asked me, there are people, a constituency in Pakistan, who for generations have only learned English, okay? And that's the language they know, that's the literature they know, and that's what they do for a living. They teach literature in English, and they probably may not have a deep knowledge of their own cultural literature or any of the native languages. So what do I have to say to those people? Well, obviously, they can still be my friends. My point was that you can do better scholarship as a citizen of a post-colonial nation or as a post-colonial scholar living elsewhere in the world if you have access to the language of the colonizers, English that I use, plus the language, any one or two languages of your own native culture. That is my point. And on another level for students and for an educational system also, that is probably a better approach to educating young people. But first, let's give you some background of where does this debate start in post-colonial studies. So somewhere in the mid-1970s or early 80s, I'm forgetting the dates, there was a Pan-African Literary Conference. And all the major African authors gathered there, and these were mostly the authors who were publishing works or producing works in colonial languages, French, English, Italian to some extent. And two major factions emerged in that debate at that conference. One led by Chinua Achebe, one of the greatest African authors, who believed that native languages, as the colonizers left them when they left the colonies, were a kind of a gift, and that the native Africans can use those languages to tell their stories, right? And Achebe is a great example of it because he's the first one of the major African authors to tell a truly African story in The Things Fall Apart. But there was another group led by Chinwezu. I have a video on him too, and Ngugi Thiong'o. I have a video on one of his novels, which you can watch. And this group insisted that no, in African context, since most of the African culture was oral and traditions were passed from one generation to another, the colonial presence and introduction of colonial languages disrupts that flow, that passage of custom, traditions, stories, narratives from one generation to another. And that was too destructive. And since a vacuum is created, that vacuum is filled by colonial sympathies, colonial aesthetics, colonial way of writing. So there was a need in the post-colonial African nation states to write literature in their own languages. And Ngugi is a great example of that. In 1970s, he changes his name from James Ngugi to Ngugi wa Thiong'o, which is a native name. He sort of renounces his Christianity and starts writing in Gikuyu. The Devil on the Cross was the first novel that he publishes in Gikuyu. And then he sees a phenomena unravel, like unroll in Africa, in Kenya. People start reading the novel. People start telling it as a folk tale. It becomes a phenomenon. So what these people were arguing, and Chinwezu is actually more radical because he wants a kind of cleansing of the African continent, removing all the European influences, removing even all the Arab and Muslim influences. But the idea is to retrieve or articulate an identity which is African, but African in modernity. That's what Chinwezu talks about. So after this, of course, Ngugi writes his famous book, Decolonizing the Mind. Chinwezu had already published Decolonizing the African Mind. These are the two big books that deal with the issues of language and how when a foreign language and its aesthetics is imposed, especially on an oral culture, what happens to the subjectivities of the people learning these? Do they start thinking like Englishmen? And if they do they also develop a sort of distrust of their own culture? Do they start thinking of their own cultures as inferior? So this was some of the background of my earlier lecture on the questions of language and power. Now, how does it work? Let's take the example of the kind of educational system the British introduced in India. Now, the biggest fight in India was, it is amply explained in Gauri Vishwanathan's work, Masks of Conquest, was between the Orientalists and the Anglicists, right? The Orientalists believed that the natives must learn their own languages, Sanskrit, Farsi, any other languages, and that's what they must be taught. That's what was taught in Delhi College and other places that the British had established. And the Anglicists believed that no, by just keeping them in their own culture, we are denying them the opportunity to enter the mainstream British culture. So we should give the natives an English education. And Macaulay famously gives a speech in the House of Lords about it. And part of that speech was sincere, because he said, we need to give them our language so that they can become part of our empire. But that role was limited. They were only supposed to be given the language so that they could function within it, and not so that they could become scholars and philosophers in it. So the educational system that the British developed is a system of education which has different tiered board exams, right? After 8th grade, a centralized board of education sends in the papers, you attempt them, reproduce the answers, and someone else marks them and sends them back. Same after 10th grade, same after 12th grade. The purpose of that was to standardize the exam, but also to encourage rote memory. So still in India and Pakistan, the government schools still follow the same process. Students are given 100 questions the year of their 10th grade. All they do is test prep, and then they reproduce those answers in the board exam, and papers are sent to different examiners who mark them. They don't know who their students are. Where do they come from? It's sort of standardized, but what it encourages is a sort of anti-intellectualism and reliance on rote memory, which we used to call rata, right? But there's a parallel educational system that is also developed both in India and Pakistan and elsewhere in the colonies, and those are the ones we call the English medium schools, right? Some of them are remnants of old times. Some of them are deeply prestigious schools, right? And what they do is they mostly teach English as it is taught in England. They use a Cambridge curriculum. They used a different system of grading. Their texts are probably imported from Britain, right? And so what they are teaching these students in Pakistan is the kind of English that is taught in Britain, and the kind of literature and history that is taught there. There is nothing wrong with that. There is nothing wrong with learning world history. But the loss happens when these students actually are never taught Urdu literature, Punjabi literature, Sindhi literature. And maybe, I mean, you're a better judge of this, maybe they also develop a certain disdain for native languages, right? Or people who speak native languages or native literatures. Maybe their only idea of good literature becomes English literature. And that's a great loss, right? So in these post-colonial parallel educational systems, we are either producing a whole generation of students who are uncritical, who rely on rote memory, and maybe they are very nativist in their ideas. Maybe they're also being taught that their own language is the only one and everyone else is an enemy. I'm not sure, but maybe they're internalizing that. And then there is a group of students, mostly bourgeois, upper class, middle class families, who are, while living in India and Pakistan and Kenya, are learning the curriculum developed by former colonizers, and maybe also internalizing those sensitivities, and also internalizing a certain disdain of their own culture, of their own cultural history, or just simply lack of knowledge of it. And that is what I was trying to highlight. That is how language policies connected to education impact the kind of human subjectivities that the educational system creates. Now, what to do with it? Where do I stand? Now, as you might have viewed many of my other videos, or you might have read some of my work, I am not a nativist. I don't believe in extremes. I believe that the most position or placing of most possibility is somewhere in the middle, where we take the best of this culture and take the best of that culture and cobble together a self that can sustain itself, right? So in an ideal world, if I were to design an educational curriculum, I will have the best of both. I will give my students a thorough education in their own culture, in their own literatures, native, Urdu, Punjabi, Sindhi, Brahmi, whichever is available. If it's not available, we need to retrieve it so that they know what their people historically have thought and how have they written about love, death, and loss, right? So that they are in touch with their own culture. And then also teach them French, British literature, because then it becomes comparative. Then they are not internalizing that somehow French and English literature is better. That's where I stand, somewhere in the middle, playing with both ends, not trying to jettison all the things colonial and becoming a nativist. Or so that's why I've never really supported the Urdu only movement. But then I will not also be for English only movement. If you have read my work, you already know that I place myself in that precarious position, neither this nor that, but something in between. But thinking of it more pragmatically, I teach post-colonial studies in the United States. So if someone comes to me and asks me they would like to study with me, the first question I ask them is, which region would you like to focus on? And two, do you know any of those languages? I cannot imagine training a scholar in post-colonial studies who specializes on India or on Pakistan, Bangladesh, or anywhere in Africa, who only is doing it in English, right? They have to know at least one extra language, possibly from the region about which they're going to be writing and reading about. I had a wonderful student who is now a tenured professor. When she came to me to ask me if I would be her director, that was the question I asked her. And she went and learned Arabic. She already knew Hebrew. So her dissertation is on Palestinian-Israeli relationships and the novels based on it, which is now a book. But she had the cross-cultural linguistic and literary experience to bring to post-colonial studies. So overall, to conclude, the way language was imposed or introduced in the colonies had its consequences. It produced human subjectivities. None of it was random. The school system was meant to align the loyalties of the students towards the empire. The solution to that isn't saying we're not going to read English or study English, or we don't need to read Shakespeare. No, the solution is to do both, to retrieve, study, and know at least one native language and its literatures so that you can incorporate them in your discussions, and then read them in comparison to whatever you study in your English, French, or other classes. It will also enrich your experience as a teacher. What is absolutely, in my opinion, not desirable is to just rely on one and say, this is the only tradition I believe in. That will not lead you to do a more enlightened scholarship, and it certainly won't help your teaching or your performance as a human being in the world. So these are some of my thoughts on it. I hope this clarifies some of the things. If I have still left something unsaid or unexplained, please do post a comment in the comment sections, and I will try to answer that. And if you have any other concerns or questions, do also post those. And if you like these videos and these lectures, please do subscribe. I am, as always, thankful to you for joining me, and I will see you next time.